Hello and welcome to Are You a Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today, I'm interested in foreign policy analysis, in a special way, how to approach the foreign policy, especially when you deal with very complicated topics and sensitive information. And my expert today is Dr. Eldad Ben-Aharon. Hello, Eldad.
Hello there. Great to be here, Martin. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Ben-Aharon is currently 2023-25 an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow in international security at Dublin City University. He earned his PhD in history from the Royal Holloway University of London in 2019. His primary research area is international history of the Middle East during the Cold War, which he explores through the lens of archival research, foreign policy analysis, and interviews with prominent diplomats and intelligence elite. His research has been published in leading academic journals, including the European Journal of International Security, Intelligence and National Security, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Oral History Review, and Cold War History, among others. His academic publications also include 3 book chapters in prestigious edited volumes, among them one in Genocide Denial in the 21st Century and one in Transitional Justice. So I divided this interview into 2 parts. In the first part, we're going to speak about some basics about the foreign policy, while in the second part, we'll show you some case studies related to 2 articles that Dr. Ben-Aharon wrote. So my first question is, how do you define foreign policy? What does foreign policy mean for you in that broader political science context?
So foreign policy, it's fundamentally entails 2 important components. One is the nation state and its institutions. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the government and other branches of the government that has to basically shape policy, make decisions, and so on. And that's, let's say, the more realistic aspect of foreign policy. But there is also an important aspect of foreign policy, which is the human actors, the human nature of those actors. And that could be, of course, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense, other state elite, also intelligence officials and intelligence elite. So they also, their beliefs, their culture, their even religion beliefs and professional experience could tell us a lot about how they shape foreign policy. Sometimes also it's not really about specific individual, it's a small group of individuals who can, by using those, of course, important aspects, could form and implement foreign policy decision-making. So it's really important to look at these 2 main players, the institutions and those human actors separately, but also together. So look at them as intertwined into the process of decision making in foreign policy.
Some students, they ask me in Scotland that there is foreign policy and there is diplomacy. And some, they were not sure what is what. So is diplomacy part of foreign policy, or is diplomacy like broader name for foreign policy issues? How would you address these interesting questions? Because this is what I faced in Scotland.
This is a really good question. It's a classic, let's say, debate about definitions. Okay, so it really matters what kind of sources, period, focus we have in our research. Diplomacy refers more, I think, to the more, let's say, rational aspect of foreign policy and the more public aspect of foreign policy and how institutions frame their, or also convey their foreign policy decision making to the public. It's more like let's say, the more evident aspect of foreign policy. And foreign policy decision making will refer more to the personal, cultural aspect of foreign policy, which could also be a covert aspect of foreign policy decision making. But there are some overlaps, indeed. In common language about international politics, we often see how these two terms are being intertwined or used on a frequent basis in any conversation about international politics.
Foreign policy analysis has some evolution. There are several steps that we can see in the history, and how this impact the international relations from your perspective.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question because the evolution of international relations and foreign policy analysis specifically has to do a lot with the Second World War and how it unfolded to the Cold War, bipolar dynamics, and then to the post-Cold War period. But if we look at the field of international relations more broadly, it was basically established after the Second World War, in which the focus has been on the nation-state system. So how state, great powers as well, of course, the superpowers, and then the secondary powers of the regional powers, and then smaller state, responded to the bipolar tension and to these two superpowers competing with each other, and how governments and state institutions respond to this tension, what kind of policies they made towards this bipolar dynamics. At the same time, we see some other non-traditional actors, like, for example, leaders or international organizations or non-governmental organizations try also to respond to this type of dynamics. I will give an example. When we research Israeli foreign policy, we see how, of course, there is the government, the foreign ministry, other, for example, intelligence institutions like the Mossad and the Shin Bet. But we also see how international Jewish organizations, but also local Jewish organizations, try to formulate their foreign policy and engage with the world as well as the government. So we see two competing institutions, entities that try to formulate their foreign policy and advocate for the Jewish movement. Okay, so and that was happening already in the Cold War. So we see already that there is another dimension in foreign policy that must get attention from scholars. Okay, so it's not just the formal institutions and the state institutions, but it's also the non-governmental institutions and maybe also individuals that should get some attention from scholars that's researching a certain period or researching a certain topic.
In the contemporary foreign policy analysis, are there any main theories or frameworks that you as a researcher are facing and dealing with?
First of all, yes, there are. I'm not dealing with all of them, but broadly speaking, there are a few aspects to foreign policy analysis, one of which is the feminist theory, which gets attention from scholars these days, specifically how women that leads world politics, they framed as decision makers into a world that is dominated by men. Okay? And we have also comparative foreign policy analysis, which looks at similar case studies, for example, or different case studies that looks at a specific leader or specific state elite and try to examine them through some comparative analysis. So these are the two main frameworks of foreign policy analysis, but different case studies can, of course, develop the theory further. And this is the whole idea about trying to theorize world politics. We don't have all the answers, and we try to look at different case studies to enrich the theory as well. It's not just explaining the case study. So with the current tools we have already in foreign policy analysis, we can provide quite a lot of interesting insight about specific case studies. But sometimes it's not enough, and we want also to develop the theory because it's an open-ended theory in which we can still build more layers to the theory. Foreign policy analysis is, by nature, it's interdisciplinary. So we look at sub-theories from fields of anthropology, psychology, geography, economics, and several other disciplines of social science. So we can always expand the theory further.
What's your opinion about some claims that the foreign policy analysis is Western-centric?
That's a great question, actually. More broadly speaking, before I answer your question, the field of international relations has been frequently accused of being too European-centric. Okay, so many of the theories were developed based on case studies of European countries, and some of which don't really apply to other regions in the world. So the same goes for foreign policy analysis, of course. What it means that we sometimes need to adjust the theory and look at case studies from the Middle East or from other regions in the world and look at them differently in the sense that we need to adjust the theory or the order of some steps we use to analyze case studies. I will give you an example. Also, this problem emerged in critical security studies. Okay, so we have securitization theory, which is a linear process of using a speech act against a security threat, and then we need to look at the audience, the political audience or the legal audience, whether or not they accept the threat, and therefore now they can also use the special measures against the threat. But this security theory, securitization theory, has been focusing on European case studies, and at the beginning, at least when it was launched in the early 90s, by the Copenhagen School. And then a second generation of this securitization framework came along and said, well, this framework applies to the European countries, but what about other countries in the world? What about other regions in the world where this linear process doesn't really apply? So we need to think how to order the securitization process differently to understand security threats that are being perceived subjectively by security actors. So all this makes sense somehow. Also with regards to foreign policy analysis. So we cannot use the European model to examine all other regions in the world. We need to look at the Middle East separately, and the culture in the Middle East, and the traditions, the religion, of course, importance makes a lot of difference in the Middle East, as well as other regions in the world. But this is also the work of area specialists that needs to also adjust some of the theories in order to use them and expand them also on case studies that has to do with the expert region.
How do individual actors versus institutional structures dynamically shape the foreign policy? Because many people, many researchers, they always balance between the leaders writing about someone and writing about something as structures. So what's your opinion about this?
I think we need to look at these two entities as complementary entities. They don't compete with one another necessarily. They complement each other. And I think we can actually look at both of them to better understand decision-making, because the state institutions or the entities of the nation state provide us the framework in which decision-making are taking place. But that alone that could emphasize a lot the rational aspect of the policy decision-making. However, the decision-making is not always rational. It's not always clear, and it's not always based on rational decision-making. So we need to also to have the human aspect of decision-making, and therefore we turn to examine leaders. and state elite, and sometimes even smaller diplomatic actors. Okay, like even an ambassador could make a difference. Okay, so we need to examine these two entities in order to better understand foreign policy decision making. So it's not just this or just that, and we cannot, the way I see it, address it as a zero-sum game. It's all this or that. It's both. Both are essential. Sometimes we don't have good access to one. Okay, so we need to find another way and another source maybe to trace their decision making and the way they think or analyze a problem. But it's ideal to have both, and sometimes we can have both.
As you said, it's not always easy to get sources, information, and materials about the research or what's needed for the research. So in light of the changing scenarios and global geopolitics and all those complications, what methodologies have emerged as crucial for research, for analyzing the foreign policy? What sort of contemporary trends can we see?
So, first of all, foreign policy analysis as a subfield really developed after in the end of the Cold War, in the post-Cold War period, where it was quite evident that there's far more actors in international relations which need to receive attention from scholars. Of course, emerging international organizations such as the EU, okay, for example, but not just the EU. Of course, there are other international, supranational organizations that became influencers of world politics. But it was also evident that, of course, there are leaders and state elite that influence, shape, and also make very important decisions sometimes by themselves, okay, especially in a non-democratic context, which needs our attention as scholars. So definitely this is, we see this pattern emerging in the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period in the last 20 years. However, diplomatic history and scholars who work on diplomatic history, diplomatic historians work more with archival research, and therefore they are more limited to this type of sources. And within this group of scholars, of course, this is a broad group of scholars. We can see some scholars, diplomatic historians, who work also with other type of sources like interviews, media interviews, sometimes even oral interviews, although it's not that common, okay, because oral interviews is more considered as a journalistic and social science method. But we can maybe discuss this in the second part of this podcast. But we see also how some scholars are really focusing on the formal archival research and the formal archival records of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I find it personally a bit unconvincing, because it hinders us as scholars to really understand the human nature, the culture, all the things that I mentioned before, and how they shape foreign policy and how they influence the decision making. So I believe this is actually emerging with the previous answer, that we need to examine both and not just one. But that's a problem in international relations research, that the nation state receiving too much attention from scholars, and sometimes we call it also methodological nationalism. This is an important term which students and scholars of international relations needs to be more familiar with, this term of methodological nationalism. That in a nutshell, methodological nationalism refers to the nation state as the only and most natural unit for analysis, because human beings belongs to a certain nation state. However, it's not always the case, right? And it cannot be the only and the primary unit of analysis. There are other actors, which we just mentioned, that must get our attention as scholars as well. Leaders of the oppositions, for example, or even the prime minister and the president of a certain country, and the Ministry of Defense, the Minister of Defense, and the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor. We know by now that by research that has been done already, that these people, these individuals, whether it's men or women, they weigh quite a lot in decision making. So we need to look at them as well. But of course, traditional scholars of international relations and scholars who are more focusing on the on archival research, on formal archival research, will not find it too convincing. And I understand why, because they want to see the formal decision making, but it's, I guess, more complicated than that.
Many times there are new factors which are coming to your research, for instance, technology, climate change. How do you deal with that, and what is your opinion about the impact of those new notions penetrating the international relations research more and more?
Well, this is it's a good question, of course, because it has to do with contemporary international relations. I did not come across these two topics in my research project so far, so I cannot engage with this specifically as a part of my research. But I can try to answer this question more broadly. I think that, of course, technology, climate change, all of these topics that are hot topics in international relations must get our attention and be also coded within every research that is being conducted right now on international relations. All right, but more specifically, looking at softwares and technology and research, some softwares are really helpful to some scholars, but they cannot really replace the hands-on research and the more traditional way of doing things. It means that people go really to the bottom of reading all the materials, understanding them, analyzing them. That doesn't matter right now if it's qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis. And it really depends, of course, on the type of the research methodology and so on. But while some softwares could help scholars save time, they cannot really replace the way I see it. The human mind and the analytical framework that the scholars use to conduct the research and to write the research and basically convey the research result. And I really believe that the ethical discussion around AI, for example, and some other tools needs to be more evident, and students also must be familiar with this, with the risks of using AI, and also with the ethical standards that these days are being actually debated on how to use AI in a way which is transparent, in a way which is also ethical. And these discussions are not, of course, they are open-ended, and also they are still evolving. They are actually quite at the beginning of, or the early years of this debate. So we're going to see how this evolves. But these topics has to be addressed by scholars, but it really depends. My let's say bottom line of all of this must be addressed based on the topic that is being researched.
The last question for this first part.
Mm-hmm.
I was asked in many universities and in many meetings, how important is it to have a stance from the theoretical point of view when analyzing foreign policy? For instance, some students, they tend to say, I am a constructivist. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing everything from the constructivism or constructivist point of view. Some of them, they are neoliberals and so on. What's your opinion about this? Is it really important to have this stance, or it's better to have more universal perspective?
This is a great question. I think that students are really busy with trying to define themselves about the topic or about a specific theoretical framework, and I think it's not really important, especially when you are a student, because this type of definition is actually narrowing the possibility of understanding bigger, complex problems, some of which students encountering with during their studies, or they want to write their thesis project about this or another topic which is really complex, and trying to narrow it to one aspect of the theory, such as, for example, constructivism, really limits and hinders even the student to be able to determine and get to the bottom of the problem. So to conduct in-depth research. So I really recommend students, but also scholars, not try to define themselves throughout one school or one limited aspect of the theory, because it's limiting the lens, limiting the ability to see the wider picture and the more, especially in really multi-level, multi-complex, multi-layer problems. It really distracts scholars from seeing the big picture.
Let's go to the case study section. And in case study section, there are two articles written by Eldad. So the first article is Doing Oral History with the Israeli Elite and the Question of Methodology in International Relations Research. What is this article about, Eldad?
So this article summarizing my field research experience during my PhD studies between 2015 and 19. But when I think about these questions or the topics I was writing about in this article, I was also quite interested about them earlier on when I was writing my MA thesis back in 2013 and 14. So I was actually in the end of my PhD thinking, why shouldn't I write, or somewhere towards the end of it, why shouldn't I write a methodological piece about my experience doing extensive archival research on the one hand in Israel, at the same time also interviewing these state officials and different state officials with different titles, with different experience, and try to actually share the readers, in this case it was the oral history review, what kind of experience I had with this in this specific field, and also how did I, what was the challenges researching a topic which was quite sensitive, Israel recognition, non-recognition of the Armenian genocide, and the question why it's not being recognized by Israel at the very early stages of this campaign, of the Armenian campaign for genocide recognition back in the 70s and the 80s. But at the same time, really, when we discussed earlier the methodological question of how to look at a more comprehensive relationship between state officials, state elite, and the ministries and the entities that are more responsible to formulating the policy and introducing it to the public. So I thought about this tension a lot, and then I thought, how can I really share the readers with these insights, and also show them a little bit about my experience. So originally this article was written, it was longer, and it had 5 case studies, but I trimmed this a bit and shortened it to 3 case studies. So I was trying to basically, after discussing the limitations of archival research in Israel, and how did I actually conduct the elite oral history project I had in my PhD, then I shared a number of quotes from my field research and about more generic topics of Israeli foreign policy that does not necessarily has to do with this, with my PhD about Israel's policy on the Armenian genocide, and just see how this different state elite, who comes from various diplomatic, also intelligence positions, what do they share with me? What did they said? What did they emphasize, and what was also in common? And I think that through these three different subtopics, I was able to demonstrate the possibilities and also the potential of conducting oral history project in Israel.
So the first question, we want to understand your research methods. What were they about?
So in my PhD, I focused quite a lot on archival research on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and how did they respond to Turkey's pressure not to recognize the Armenian genocide back in the late 70s and 80s. However, I found this very challenging because I was quite lucky that some archival records that contains hundreds, if not thousands, of formal records were available, and I was able to retrieve them, read them thoroughly, and understand, and be able to actually write about these topics, subtopics, and integrate them into my PhD thesis. But I found that there's also some gaps in these archival records. I found that some periods were not really available, and some topics or subtopics were not really available. They were still classified and not available to scholars like me to study them. So I thought, well, how do I exactly overcome this problem, and how do I deal with these gaps, right? And this is already started back when I was working on my MA thesis in the University of Amsterdam back in 2013-14. And then I thought, well, that's great. I can interview some state elite, ambassadors, former ambassadors, even scholars and policymakers who work on this topic, and they can share with me their experience and they can answer specific questions. And it was a great experience. So I thought, well, this is a great way to overcome some of these gaps, not all of them, but some of these gaps, and also inject into this, to my writing, some of the human aspect of decision making, and how actually policymakers engage personally with these big questions. Okay, so it was a great experience, and therefore I decided I will follow through this type of methodology also in my PhD research. And so these are the main methods I used in my in both of my MA thesis and then my PhD thesis. Extensive archival research, 70-80% of the sources are archival, which makes it more an international history of the Cold War, of the late Cold War. But at the same time, I'm very interested in the foreign policy analysis aspect and the culture, the way in which decision-making were taking place, and how the individual diplomats responded to some of the drama and the questions they had to address.
And what were the challenges? Because you mentioned that not everything was available, which is like always in research. When I'm doing some research as well, and it's always the problem.
So my experience in the 10 years that I'm interviewing has showed me that it becomes easier and easier over time, because some of the narrators, some of the people you contact, they look at your record, they look at what you publish, they look at basically your academic merit, and they say, oh, this guy, he interviewed him and him. Oh, okay. So it's first of all easier to recruit them as interviewers, but also they share with you a bit more. They take the interview in a more serious manner. But I can't really generalize about all the people I speak with. Some of them are, let's say, more patient, they want to share with you more because they feel like they're in the stage in their career where they can talk a bit more freely, and also they see this as let's say, an important task for their legacy. So they try to give you as much time as possible. But it's really hard to generalize. But if I need to give an advice to young scholars, if they ask themselves if they should do it or not, definitely do it, because first of all, it's a great experience, and you'll be surprised by the way in which some of the people you contact will be happy to speak with you, and I'll also share with you some of their knowledge. So And of course, you will knock on some doors and some people will say, no, I'm not available. Wow, so many students these days try to contact me and I'm too busy for that. I cannot speak to everyone, so I'm sorry, I have to say no. Or there are different kind of excuses, but one will be surprised how many people, how many state elite, former state elite would like to actually share their story, share their experience. This is really an amazing way of understanding foreign policy. And of course, specifically, I'm now discussing or referring to Israel, but it depends actually on the country, of course, and the culture in that country, because the scholar, the researcher also, it's not, of course, compulsory, but it's helpful to understand the language, understand the culture in that country. And I also wrote about that a little bit in the article itself, that I got different kind of answers, some of which might be understandable by a non-Israeli scholar as a no, but actually it's a yes. So they will give you their number, but they say, okay, I don't make appointments. Call me when you are there and we'll discuss it. So some people will say, oh, in my culture, people make appointments. But within Israel, I mean, in the Israeli culture, everything happens spontaneous. And lots of people really don't like to commit. So they say, once you are there, call me and we can make an appointment. That's very Israeli, and that's quite a positive. That's a yes. I would say that's a yes.
Great. And what about technology? When you were writing this article, like you were mostly with the Word and writing in a paper notes, or you use some different softwares?
A lot of time, research students are quite poor, so I was able to buy a really good recording device, and I made sure that I can use it as also as a USB. But it didn't really replace the fact that I had to listen to all the interviews and transcribe them myself, and I didn't use any automatic software to do that. I know it's quite old school, but that's the type of equipment I had back then, and I had to just do the things the old way. And also, I think it's more in depth, it's more thorough as a student to go through the interviews and transcribe them yourself, because then you are more aware of what things been said. How did you hear yourself asking some questions? You can learn from actually transcribing the interviews and learning how to become a more efficient and better interviewer. Okay, asking the questions in a specific tone, or hearing how the narrative, how the answers are being formulated, or what happens in between when they think about the answers, or maybe they didn't like one of the questions, so they start with. So you can learn a lot from just listening and transcribing. So that's, let's say, an important phase as a research student, which I recommend all students and researchers who are doing oral history to actually take this as an opportunity, and not as cutting corners and doing. I know that softwares could save a lot of time, but there is no shortcuts with this.
I fully agree with you, because I am also in that category. I have the old-fashioned Japanese voice recorder. And once I went to one embassy to record an ambassador, and he was like, "Oh, you don't have the Mac laptop or those fancy iPhones?" And no, I have just the voice recorder. And he said, like, that's interesting. I said, like, this is about you, and I want to interview you. I'm not dealing with the Apple Mac or those fancy technologies, because I want to see how you perform, how you think, and what's your tone of language. Maybe you will not like some of my questions, so that will be visible in the voice as well. So I think that old-fashioned style, it's very, very fundamental when conducting research, because, like, honestly, you can have the latest technology, But still, it's about person. It's about his thoughts, and you are the researcher examining his thoughts or her thoughts. Not examining what artificial intelligence is making for you as output. So I'm very happy that you also in that category. Let's go to the second article. The second article is methodological and epistemological reflection on elite interviews and the study of Israel's intelligence history. Interview with Ephraim Halevi. Just for those who don't know, Ephraim Halevi is or was a boss of Mossad. So again, the same questions for this article. What was the methodology when you were writing this article?
So this article was written in a more advanced phase of my academic career. It was also based on my oral history project as a PhD student, and based on two separate interviews I conducted with Ephraim Halevi, the ninth director of the Mossad. And I was using this interview output just to explain how this type of interviews are so important to us as scholars who try to research the intelligence history of Israel. Also explaining that intelligence and foreign policy are deeply intertwined, and it's not it's superficially and artificially being separated by many scholars. But it's actually really intertwined, especially with this Mossad elite. That they do so much they take so much weight on their back, conducting also diplomacy. So they are expert diplomats as well, and just thinking about them as intelligence people, it's really overlooking this important dimension of their work, and therefore we must strive to approach them, to use their knowledge, and to try to convince them to talk to us, and using, of course, very specific questions that tailor to the topic one is working on, and of course tailor to a very specific event or something we are studying. But we can also ask them some broader questions and try to pick their brain, for example, and then see how they respond to these questions, because they have extensive knowledge. They have they can connect a lot of dots we can't. And speaking to as many as possible intelligence elite, especially in that caliber, could open totally new avenues for research. So I think it's an essential process. And last but not least, also sharing the interview outputs and also publish them as texts that could be valuable to others. It's also important because now these days some scholars do conduct research and have their own private oral history archive, but they don't share it with anyone. So this is a valuable source of knowledge in which scholars also should, I believe, share it with other scholars. So this, by publishing it as partly as a journal article, I'm trying to use this as an example how to basically share my knowledge with other people, and maybe quotes of this interview would be useful to another scholar. Basically, that's what I was trying to do. But I was also in this, especially in this first part of the article, trying to engage more closely with the scholarship in intelligence studies and critical intelligence studies, and look at the importance of interviews broadly discussed in the field of intelligence and national security, and using Israel as a case study to engage with this bigger debates about the Anglosphere and the dominance of the English-speaking countries in this field of research. So it's United States, Canada, UK, New Zealand, and Australia. Okay, and how countries in the Middle East, especially Israel, being neglected or partly neglected, now a little bit less than before, are being neglected from this discussion and these debates. And it's quite a shame, because Israel provide actually a really interesting case study, because it belongs somewhat to the West, especially in terms of the culture of intelligence and the way in which there are very close connections and sharing knowledge with intelligence, parallel intelligence institutions in those countries. But at the same time, Israel is rooted in the Middle East, and it has also some Arabic culture, Middle Eastern culture embedded in this, in some of the processes, it's evident. You speak to the people, you see it's part of being an Israeli institution. So it's a really interesting and complex also case study, which needs more attention, and therefore I was trying to at least open the door for that discussion. But of course, one journal article cannot really grasp or thoroughly discuss all of these important points, but just try to contextualize this case study for future research.
I can imagine that you were enthusiastic because you were interviewing Mossad director. But on the other hand, if I was facing Mossad director, it's also a challenge, to ask right questions, to react to his answers. So how was it in real life? Was it like in-person interview, or was it like we have a Zoom interview?
No, it was in person. All the interviews I conducted back in my PhD, also MA and PhD. MA for sure, I did all of them. I met physically with all my interviewees. And in the PhD period, PhD research, I've conducted 95% of the interviews face-to-face. So they happened or in Jerusalem, or they took place in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, usually in their houses or in the offices, chambers. And I find it very, very important to meet them in their in a setting where it's suitable for them to speak openly and they feel comfortable, the sort of comfort zone. And I found that meeting them in their houses sometimes it's nice. It brings a better result because they feel very much at home, as they should. They feel they can speak openly about some stuff and becomes more friendly. Friendly in a way that of course, they don't share with you anything they don't need to share, and they're very strict about it, but they feel more comfortable. So one is stretching, the interviewer is stretching his ability as a interviewer to have the full attention of the interviewee and getting into the zone where the interview can take place and bring the best results. But also speaking, conducting the interview in the office with a closed door, it's also fine. This is where they feel a bit more strict and a bit more, let's say, less patient than in their house. But basically, they share with you whatever they can. And I had this experience with some people and some others. So I can compare, but it's really also about the nature, about the individual person and his character, his experience, how patience is, how much patience does one have, and it really changed from one individual to the other.
Eldad, one of the questions often asked by students is how to handle sensitive information or something that you get from the interviewee and you consider this as not secret, but might be quite sensitive, might be considerable for security. The question is, as a researcher, should you publish all you get from those people, or should you think twice, or should you consult what to publish with the interviewee, or how does it work in real practice? especially when you deal with those difficult, complicated, and sensitive topics?
This is a wonderful question, and I would be happy to answer it. So basically, there are a number of methods in which one can use to verify what he can or cannot publish and what he can or cannot use when he's interviewing or after the interview, in the post-interview period where you transcribe the interview and you say, oh, this is sensitive. What am I going to do with it? So I will start from the beginning. First thing first, it's really important to be clear about that with the speaker, with the narrator, explaining that this interview is being conducted for research purposes. It will be used for this and that, for writing a thesis, for example, or a book, or a journal article, or a conference paper, and so on. And being clear about that also makes one understand that the other side understands. It's clear for them what you're going to do with it. You're not going to publish it more on Facebook as a post. Okay. The second thing is also to explain that you are, of course, have to adhere to some regulations, to all history association regulations. It has to do, of course, with the university and the ethical department. But the ethics are that the narrator has to sign, for example, a consent form that make sure that he or she read the purpose of the project, the research project, but also they had a chance to stop the interview and consider the questions and the answers they are responding to, what kind of answers they respond to the questions, and also asking to speak anonymously, for example, about some topics. That's also fine. And the last thing, it's really important that they receive in advance their transcription, the transcription of the interview, and they can read it thoroughly and also say, well, I didn't like this or that. I'm asking to delete it from the interview. It's the right to do so. Also, making sure that the word choice or some things that they said are well understood. This is a chance for them to actually reread it and make sure that they are fine with it. And this is a standard procedure, which I've been doing with all my interviews throughout my career as an oral historian for this purpose, for interviewing Israeli and non-Israeli elite. But with Halevi specifically, it was a little bit a different process because he also received the transcription of this interview, which is going to be published in this journal, specifically in the Intelligence and National Security. He had to agree to be published in that journal, and also agree to he gave his consent to publish it in the journal, but also he read the transcription and gave his consent to be published in this way, with the same with these questions, with these answers, and so on. So this process was a bit more detailed and specific, but I believe that all historians should use this process. This is really important, especially with the state elite and people who can, let's say, share some sensitive information. But I really didn't came across a situation where a narrator which shared with me something so sensitive, which he never discussed with anyone else, unless they mention it at the outset that they will share it. And there was one case, and they asked to speak anonymously, but otherwise they usually speak openly about things, and they just share what they know.
And Eldad, when you have those interviews and you have the transcripts or you have the MP3s as a recording tracks, what's happening after you publish the article? You delete everything or you archive those recordings and transcripts?
No, first of all, I don't delete them. And I try to archive them, but this is where funding become essential. Okay, so we know that funding could make our work easier, also easier in the sense that we can share it with others, but to create some kind of a respiratory system where you can archive and share with the public your interviews output and so on. This is something that needs to be created, and it costs some money and time to create. So I cannot really undertake such a project myself. But what I do is actually share my interview outputs in those journal articles. And also, of course, if some people want to use them, they can approach me and they can ask for certain interview output or read the transcription. Of course, this is always possible. As I mentioned before, and also mentioned this in the article with Halevi, building these archives, all history archives, are extremely important process in us building the knowledge and expanding the knowledge about Israeli intelligence and national security. And unfortunately, this is there's lack of awareness and also lack of significant attempts to build something like that. But as I mentioned, it's also a matter of resources which are not always available. But it's also about awareness, and I was trying to actually build an awareness through this article, writing this article about the need of this type of archives, which, by the way, they are available in other countries in the world. Of course, United States, the UK, there are all history collections of state elite, of of diplomats, national security people who there were significant interview outputs that is now archived and open to public, and people can use it just like any other library. And this is an amazing research resource.
The last question for today's interview. You are dealing with very complicated topics, and we can see this when going through your publications. What's your motivation to do this? What drives your research enthusiasm and research power to discover and rediscover all those issues, events, and conduct interviews with the elites?
Wow, this is a great question. When I have to think about what is my motivation, it's purely intellectual. I really want to understand these big questions better through using different lens and different methodologies, and trying to find out new answers to old questions or to big topics like that. And I really believe that even though there's so many publications on the topics I've been working on, some aspects of this complex topics has not been studied yet. And sometimes different lands could provide new answers or new ways to think about the problem, which was not has not been done before. So that's my primary motivation. But also, I really want to contribute this knowledge to public debates and also scholarly debates, and that's my primary motivation to write about this complex and historical yet contemporary topics.
Eldad, thank you very much for your time, for your insightful thoughts and remarks for our audience and students. I wish you all the best energy for your research, for going to deeply discover and rediscover those topics, those complicated topics. It's a real pleasure to read your articles and your work, which I will put into YouTube description. And all the best to your work, to your research, and we expect more articles, more books, and more interviews with you, which I really enjoy. And I think we answer many questions, and really, really important questions for junior researchers, for students, but also it's a good reflection for the senior researchers. Sometimes even if you are senior researcher, it's good to think again, what I'm doing, how I'm doing, can I do more, Thank you very much, Eldad. Really appreciate your time.